Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the International Leadership Series for the 2020-2021 academic school year. The theme for this year, once again, is the personal is political, social justice, and equity for all. And as a reminder to our folks here, we are focusing the International Leadership Series on Oxfam's Elements of Global Citizenship. And there's 7 elements of global citizenship that we are focusing in on over the course of 7 years. Last year, we focused on sustainable development, and all of our speakers focused on that. This year, we are focusing on social justice and equity, and these are 2 of the elements that we've covered thus far, but it's important to be mindful of what are the other elements that we have inside of being a good global citizen. And so human rights, which will be our focus next year, peace and conflict, identity and diversity, power and governance, and then finally globalization and interdependence. These are the 7 elements of global citizenship. We've talked about social justice and equity at our first meeting as we talked about pop justice, but really social justice, as we are defining it this year, is all about creating equitable systems for whether they're cultural, political, financial systems for everyone, right? And really tearing down a lot of those barriers that exist so that everyone has an equal contributing part of our community. And so if you do have questions, please feel free to look at that. We'll also be sending out a survey as we move forward as well. And then finally, we do have our International Leadership Fellows. And once again, the requirements are up there. Those folks are here in attendance, and they will be writing reflections as well as participating in our Art for Social Justice campaign here in April. So today we are thrilled to have Julia R. Golden coming to speak with us. And our topic today is honoring my voice, navigating queer and racial equity work while providing self-care. Now more than ever in an era of Black Lives Matter, conversations on immigration and centering identities within politics, students are realizing it takes a lot of energy to advocate for themselves. This session will allow students to think about their personal identities and consider how they can advocate for themselves and others while avoiding burnout. We will talk about how identity burnout exists and what we can do so that healing can occur. And we are very lucky to have Julia R. Golden as our featured speaker today. Julia R. Golden is an experienced associate dean with a demonstrated history of working over 12 years in higher education. They are skilled in equity and access work, big picture thinking, team building, mentoring, and fundraising. They received their Bachelor of Arts in History and Sociology from the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth and their Master of Education in Student Personnel Administration from Springfield College. Julia serves as Associate Dean of Students at Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences in Massachusetts. Julia is the founder of the Ubuntu Institute for the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, or NASPA. They are a current doctoral student at the University of Massachusetts Boston, pursuing their PhD in higher education. Julia is passionate about the professional world of diversity and inclusion. For Julia, diversity and inclusion is both a process and a goal involving self-reflection on how students can impact their communities and their respective fields. Julia has introduced Safe Zone training to all 4 of their campuses. Julia believes the power of storytelling and dialogue are crucial in how we impact one another and make institutional and cultural change. Julia's ultimate goal is to one day support or build a school for young girls in Honduras, where they were born. Please welcome Julia R. Golden. So virtual applause, yay, virtual applause. Julia, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to pass the assigned privileges to, you should actually be able to do that now.
Yeah. Make sure I can do that. So again, thank you so much for having me. I think that it is so important to have these conversations. I really, being a dean means I typically I serve all students. The students that I really go out of my way to make sure that I work closely with are those from marginalized backgrounds and identities. Because I think, one of the conversations we don't often have is understanding that colleges were never really made for people of color or those of marginalized identities. We have a hard time, a lot of us see it as this is an access point that will allow us to create greatness and do more for our communities. And that is amazing. But we often don't talk about the barriers of everything we have to overcome in order to achieve that greatness. And I think in that way, we end up in some ways creating more harm because it's not enough to say, I'm here at a college, I'm here doing the work. We also have to be able to show that this work, it's taken a lot from us to continue our education, to represent your people and culture. Even if you don't want to, you still are doing that. And I think in some ways it feels like a pressure. And for me, it's often felt like an honor, but I've had to take a long time to really use my doctoral work to reflect on what has education meant to me. And I don't mean recently, I mean, what is my educational autobiography from when I was first in school to now? And I think back to my first years in school of kindergarten and first grade, and I realized even as a little baby going to school, there were a lot of things I had to navigate that I didn't realize were actually really problematic. So a lot of the work I do right now currently is saying, the resiliency that I've had to learn to keep doing this work has been something that's of an art form. And to think about where I take that going forward is so important. It's something that I take pride in, but I think is something that I have to acknowledge that it wasn't easy to get here. And I think that if we really took the chance to understand that, we would be more proud of ourselves. We'd be really excited to know and acknowledge I did that, and I'm going to continue to do that. And to say, who am I doing this for? Me, but also I know often I talk about as someone who's Latinx and queer, I do this for chosen family. I do this for not just myself. I try to speak up and do things for others as well. So I think that that's something that's different about the way I approach this work. I'm going to try to share this presentation. I'm not going to lie, for some reason, it's not allowing me to share. So let me just double check my preferences here, my system preferences. The good news is I can actually, let's see, 1 second.
So Control-Alt-D will allow you to share your content.
Okay. Let's see. So I'm on a Mac. I don't know. It says share is doesn't allow me to do so. I don't know.
All right. If you want to send me your PowerPoint,
Yes.
yeah,
Would you like me to send this to?
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, cool.
Oh. Actually, Julie, I sent you my personal email. So the students actually have the, I just by habit, I put that personal Gmail in there. So students don't email me on that one. Email at the Tammy one.
Like nothing to see here. But while we wait, I can actually start at least the conversation of what I was going to present. Just give me 1 second while I send this, so we don't waste too much time. 1 sec, and that's on me. I apologize. It's funny. I've been using Zoom and all these other forms. This is the first time I'm using this one, so I'm glad I can after this add this to my all the different ways in which I've had to present it. Okay, 1 sec. Okay, that's getting ready to send. Give me 1 sec. Okay, so that just sent. But I'll get started a little bit about, again, what some of the reasons of why I did this research and again, why it would be relevant to students. I actually, when I talk about who I am, and it's important, I don't just talk about being an associate dean. I don't talk about, a lot of this research, while it's to help my colleagues and people in student affairs understand how to attempt this work. A lot of times I'm actually teaching professionals how to work better with students. I actually feel like a lot of times in colleges, we have this hierarchy approach of students learn from educators, and educators are seen as people who are qualified to teach and or mentor. The way I actually approach this work is that I learn just as much from students as they can learn from me. To have that circular approach is actually, to me, much more formed in, I think of it as decolonizing education. So decolonizing as in, we are specifically taught usually that there's an authoritarian, that's a teacher, who teaches students. And to me, I'm saying, I don't need us to have a hierarchy. I don't need it to be there's only one expert in a room and we can only learn from them. To me, this is a conversation that we can have together. So for me, it's because being Latinx, and to be honest, I'm of a highly indigenous background from Honduras. I just want to make sure that when I approach education conversations around this, that I am considering the decolonizing effect of this, making sure that there's not just one way of learning, there's multiple ways, and not one way is better than another just because I'm told so. I think part of this too is I have to acknowledge my queer lens, or being non-binary and LGBTQ, is that for me, it's oftentimes we're taught there's only one way of being. And a lot of my life has been like, no, I can be this and those things and that, and those things together can work. And I say that because, again, in education, it's really important to acknowledge the term is called intersectionality, whereas we can have multiple identities and they can intersect with one another. So for instance, not only am I Latinx, I'm queer. Those two have separate communities and separate audiences and separate ways of me code switching and being. But there are moments when they align together and they come together. And there are also moments where they're very different. And I can't have those two identities in the same room together, which can be very painful, which is a lot of reason why I study such a subject as trauma. But my whole point is that when I'm approaching this work, I'm thinking of individuals who, whether they have multiple identities, or we have a lot of students who are multiracial. I'm sure some of you identify as biracial, multiracial, multicultural. You could have multiple spiritualities in your household. And are we even thinking about how to support students who are coming from many different ways of being? Students these days are not one thing. They're many different layers of a person. And I don't think we do a good job at honoring students at those various layers. So a lot of the work I'm trying to do is, when you advocate for yourself, you're most likely advocating for multiple layers. So the school I work at right now is Mass Pharm. It's a pharmaceutical school. It's actually a health science school as well. So for instance, one thing right there is, while your major is not a personal identity, it is, if you're a woman in STEM, you're going to have a lot of barriers to navigate. If you're a woman of color in STEM, you have even more things to navigate to be successful in your career. So my women who are going to be doctors get a lot of sexism. My women of color who are going to be doctors end up having to navigate sexism and racism just to be a doctor. And they also have to now uphold their own people, and saying, how do I uphold my own people in medicine? So I say all this to say that a lot of times, as an educator and a researcher, I'm trying to make sure that I'm honoring people's stories. And I think that's the simplest way to say where my research comes from. But it really comes from the fact that I have multiple identities, and I've often felt like I've had to choose one over the other. And I know Nayeli and I met when I worked at Salem State University in Massachusetts. And one of the first things I came into that, I remember we were doing a lot of initiatives for our Black students. And I said, we're the highest percentage-wise of people of a state school that has Latinx students or Latinos in a higher ed state school. Why are we not programming more specifically to Latinx people? And it's because the people there just hadn't had experiencing supporting Latinx students. And then I had a question. I was like, why aren't we doing more to also highlight some of the LGBTQ or queer voices here? And again, it's not bad intentions. It's that people hadn't had really that ability to do that work. And so I think it's really important to know that sometimes just us being in the room as someone who is of a marginalized identity or a person who's not of the majority, meaning white, cisgender, is that you just being in a room in itself is radical. And you just being in a room allows for people to know that these identities can exist and should persist, meaning we should be able to be successful. And there are ways to make sure that people honor our voices, but also that we check in with ourselves and say, who deserves to hear us? And I really want you all to think about that today throughout the presentation, because not everybody deserves to hear your story and about who you are. And you need to think about, when am I ready to share? And when am I ready to be my authentic self? Because for some of you, you might be like, Julia, I know who I am and I'm ready to be up there and be radical. Okay, but don't burn yourself out. Or you might be like, Julia, I'm still learning about myself. And I'll be honest with y'all, it took me to 25 years old to really fully accept, appreciate, and love myself as not only queer, but Latinx fully. And I say that because for some students, it seems really obvious. I am who I am. Why would that change? But for some students, it's not that easy. And this journey of self and identity will be a lifelong thing. And that is okay. And I feel like often feel like I'm proof of that. And 10 years ago, my identities would not be anything they are today. I just wouldn't have seen myself the same way. And for some of you, that might be the case. And for some of you, you're like, this is my identity and always been. So I think that's a little bit about who I am and why I approach the work that I do. So yeah, I don't know if the PowerPoint came through.
It didn't. And so I sent you a private message.
Oh, okay. Let me try this one more time. This is so weird. See.
Send it to my private email.
Oh, I think it sent to your work email, actually.
Correct, but I'm saying send it to my private emails because I think we have some settings set on there that
got it. Okay.
have gone through.
I got it. There we go. Yeah, so I think, one of the things that is also really important to understand about this topic too, is that before I go into this presentation, I think it's also, a lot of times I've had students, staff, and faculty, when I talk about self-care, one of the ways I first start talking about this conversation, what I'm specifically studying is also a little bit about trauma. And I just wanted to put out there, because some people, what they don't understand is they're like, well, that seems like a really specific place to start with this conversation, almost like, isn't that a bit of an overreaction? And because I think trauma obviously is seen as such a harsh word, as like, oh, trauma means there's a problem. But I'm actually talking about trauma as in, one of the things that we don't acknowledge is that things simple as microaggressions, I don't mean simple to invalidate, but I mean simple as in a concept that maybe some folks have acknowledged. A microaggression being that you meet someone who says something that you're like, was that a racial insult? Did you just try to say something to me that's hurtful? Comments like that can really add up. And one of the things that we don't often talk about is that they can actually create physical changes in your body. And so that's some of the research I personally do. And at Boston University, about 2 or 3 years ago, they actually created a study where they showed brain maps and scans of showing that there are physical differences that your body goes through when it interacts with trauma. So I say that because oftentimes people have this thought of, this isn't that big of a deal. Why are we putting it in terms of trauma and self-care? But I actually think that it's really important that we understand that sometimes even little comments can really make a big difference. Oh, thank you so much. Awesome. And I do apologize for the tech issues. So yeah, and I think, again, when we talk about honoring voices, I think that today the goal is to make sure that you all have a sense of thinking about how to honor your voice. So I think and I talked a little bit about who I am and my lenses to how I research, I guess. So I'm going to take from this article, and I do apologize for the ableist language. It says, "Am I crazy?" in quotes, because that's actually the name of this article. So I don't use it to be disrespectful of I know ableism is something I'm still working on, but so I always preface this slide by saying that. But I do use it just because it's a very important article and actually shapes a lot of the work that I do. Well, there was a study done on graduate students. I want to apply this to undergraduate students because this happens all the time. A person in this research topic talked about how they were in a classroom, a Black student, they're a graduate student, and one of the only Black student, and that a professor and other peers in the class felt a need to say, okay, can we ask you this question? So is it really true that Black people eat a lot of fried chicken? Which, if you're a Black person or a person of color, you're like, really? Like, who asks this in a classroom? But unfortunately, this happens all the time in classrooms across the nation. And so the person in this statement says, I looked at this and I thought, okay, well, you're the only one in here, so I guess we're going to have to answer this question, because there is this sense of, if I don't answer this and if I don't represent my people, then what happens is misinformation. So again, what ends up happening is a couple of things. One is, when we talk about self-censorship, and that next bullet, self-censorship is, I can't authentically be myself in this class now because I have to be Latinx Julia or queer Julia or Latinx and queer Julia. But now I don't get to just be a student and learn. I have to now represent myself on top of that, which often leads to, I'm going to self-censor, meaning that I no longer want to share anything because I'm mad that I have to represent this all the time. I might decide that I'm only going to share certain perspectives. People might say I'm combative because now I'm the angry Latinx person. And I'm sorry, but for my Latinas out there, how many times are we told, wow, you're really passionate about this? Oh, it's like, and this microaggression itself of saying, oh, so me being angry, and which is really me being frustrated and disappointed that you can't see me as more than Latinx, you're going to actually gaslight me and put that on top of me. Like, I'm the problem. No, you as a professor or you as a peer, you're the problem for putting me in this position where I have to feel resentment that I can't just be a student and learn, that instead I have to be this whole other person to represent my people, because you can't Google something about what Latinx people are and how they are. Like, that's really what's happening here. And I think that that's unfortunate, because again, you've robbed me of my education because now I have to be Latinx Julia and educate you on who I am. And that's not fair. That's not fair. And, my white students and colleagues don't recognize that they can just be, and they never have to think about how they are. And I think that that's really, that, and when we talk about whiteness, I want to be very clear here. Whiteness isn't just white people. Whiteness is a system of white supremacy in which we talk about, we are here to please whiteness. We are here to make whiteness feel comfortable. It's very important we understand the difference, because a lot of people get tripped up on this. I'm not saying this is all white people. I'm not saying that it's white people in general. I'm talking about how white people, but also people of color, don't mean to, but are socialized to please whiteness. And in doing so, I might self-sacrifice myself to please whiteness. And that's self-censorship. I will censor myself to please whiteness. And that's something that can be very harmful over time. And there's a reason why, again, talking about trauma, I might start questioning my ability. If students and faculty are talking, or mentors only asking me about, oh, well, talk about being Latinx and do this and that, and they have all these stereotypes around me, I might be like, am I supposed to be in this program? Am I supposed to be at this school? Am I part of this community? Because no one sees me as anything but this one thing. And again, that's very damaging over time. And I'm sure many of you are like, oh, I didn't know these were things to be upset about. Again, adapting to the rules and norms is actually what you say. So basically, we have this idea that the only way I'm going to get through this class is I now have to adapt to this situation. And again, I'm self-sacrificing myself to adapt. We often talk about in forms of leadership that adapting is a big leadership piece. And I think one of the ways I'm decolonizing leadership is saying, for people of color, we should never have to adapt to whiteness in forms of leadership, that we can still authentically be ourselves. I think that's very, very important to acknowledge, and what ways we do that. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then socialization and student leadership. So really what this is saying, because again, socialization is much more of a doctoral phrase, so I apologize. But what I'm really talking about here is, in student leadership, one of the goals I think that we should be doing is teaching you all how to have a toolbox of resources that you all can feel confident and good about. I'm not just leading as a student leader, but all the skills that I use, that all the skills I grew up with matter just as much. So for instance, there's a person, Dr. Terayaso, who often talks about cultural wealth, meaning that, for instance, a lot of her studies are on Latinx individuals. So for instance, how many of you had to interpret maybe doctor medical information for your parents and translate? Now, some of us would be like, you had to do that at 8 years old. That seems like really extreme if we've never had that experience. But how do we say, from a very young age, I was bilingual, and I even had the chance to represent, my parents and their medical information. And, I'm someone who can, continue to translate conversations. And I'm someone who, I had, I've been very responsible for a very long time. There's ways to take that and show what we would see, what is not necessarily everyone's experience, and show that there's strength in that, right? So taking, the fact that, Latinx people specifically do a lot of things in community, showing that, you have a community mind is another form of leadership. So again, we're going to highlight what our strengths are, rather than saying that it's deterred us from something. So I think, again, student leadership, it's challenging to say leadership does not look like one thing. Leadership can encompass parts of our cultures and parts of who we are. And in fact, it really should, because I was part of a professional development leadership. And I was like, so everything and I said to the presenter, I said, everything you're talking about is only for your white leaders. None of this has anything to do with queerness. None of this has to do with people of color. I was like, and the fact that you haven't considered that we're in a pandemic and we are in a racial pandemic, it's really upsetting. You haven't acknowledged it, meaning you haven't acknowledged that some of the people in your web chat right now barely have access to internet, barely have access to cameras, and you not acknowledging that assumes that we're all starting at the same place, but we're not. There are also many people who are parents who have many kids right now. And some of you might be, single parents or parents. And I think that these are things that we don't talk about. We act like everything's fine right now. We're just doing this remotely. No, there's a pandemic. And so student leadership has to look differently right now, because it is different, and it has to acknowledge multiple cultures. Next slide, please. So why discuss this topic? One of the other things that is really important for students and staff and faculty to understand is that the FBI has reported in 2018 that there are increased bias incidents happening all across our campuses. I try not to bring politics into this too much, but we have to acknowledge that when presidential leadership is openly acknowledging and disregarding of and saying things like, that are not only racist and xenophobic, and encouraging, white supremacist groups, that's a role model telling other people it's okay to say these things. And other people could be people we go to school with, people who are teachers, people who are peers and colleagues. And so here's the thing, we have to acknowledge that there's a reason that these bias reports have increased. So for instance, a student years ago might have been like, oh, I've only heard this maybe once a year. I've only heard this kind of racial comment. And nowadays it's happening much more often. I was talking with a friend of mine who was saying that their time in undergrad and their time in graduate school has been very different as a student of color, because now they're hearing much more of a voice that's racist. And so, having to navigate that is very scary for them. They feel an increased pressure as a person of color to be safe and keep their family safe. And this is someone who identifies as a Black individual, Black male. So, I think, again, we just want to acknowledge that the reason we're bringing up this topic is self-care has to increase for people of color, as the nation itself is having more incidents that are showing harm to people of color. And I think all of us know this to some extent. I think of, again, the Black Lives Matter era. I think of, we talk about ICE and immigration, and talking about are different communities feeling oppressed. I think of LGBTQ folks, where a lot have now been trying to suppress their rights as well. So no matter what marginalized group you're looking at, you're seeing more and more policies as well as sentiments that are harming to them. Again, for all of you, you cannot academically thrive if you're so focused on surviving. So you have to take care of yourselves. Otherwise, I'll be really honest, research shows that our academics and our grades go up when we have mentors and when we are part of student leadership. And I'll give a personal example of this. Before I was out, I was like a D or C student. The second I came out as being queer and LGBTQ, my grades went from C minuses all the way to A's and honor student. You can literally see, if you look at my undergrad transcript, the semester I came out, all of a sudden my grades just went up. And when I look back into why that is, it's that I felt confidence. I felt a comfort. I had a mentor who was LGBTQ, and I had friends who saw me for who I was. And all of that made it possible for me to now say, I'm no longer in survival mode. Now I get to thrive academically. And I'm really mad that it took me that long to academically thrive. But I also forgive myself because I was under so much pressure to just be. And so I think that that's really important, that we also tell ourselves it's never too late to be and to find ourselves and to think about who we want to become. I want to validate you all. For some of you already, I've probably said some points and you're like, wow, this is real. Or for some of you, it might have been like, I don't know, I've never thought about this. But either way, you should know that these things are real. I come across colleagues all the time, people my own age and older, who are like, this is what these emotions were this whole time. I didn't know. So yeah, I think it's sometimes we just accept life or the world as is and we don't question it, but this is real and it's okay to validate that. And I also want to encourage you all as students to take time to heal. Now, not all of you will think of this as forms of trauma or being sad. Some of you, again, will see it as resiliency. Some of you will also see it as you're just learning about it. So again, healing looks different. There's not one way of healing, and we'll talk about that again. So I personally study this through secondary traumatic stress, and the way I kind of want to put this out here. So I'm going to talk about this as in the form of being a student leader. So let's say, and I don't know how many of you are part on an e-board, or if you're a student who's a part of a maybe a student group that's identity related. So for instance, I have students who are part of a Latinx AO student leadership, or Black student leadership, or LGBTQ student leadership. They're in a group, an affinity group. Well, let's say something happened at school and, everyone in the group, maybe a student is really upset. Maybe they came forward and they said, in residence life, my roommate was homophobic to me, or they were racist to me. Now the group starts talking, and then the student leaders in that group are like, we should do something. And they're getting, they're like, but we don't know what to do. We don't have the resources to know what to do. And now everyone's really upset because this incident happened on campus. So part of secondary traumatic stress is you're the first person to respond to this because someone came to you with a problem. And let's say it's not just this first student meeting. Let's say throughout the semester, more people are saying something bad has happened that feels like, racial or homophobic or what have you. It's, sexist. Over time, as a student leader, you're like, I'm holding all of these stories of my peers and I don't have anywhere to place this and I don't have anywhere to put it. And honestly, I can't sleep well. I'm anxious about this. I don't have a mentor to talk to this about. The school doesn't have a way for me to report this or something of that sort. So now I'm really sad. Now I'm not sleeping well. My academics might be slipping a little bit. For some students, it's more so. But really, we're acknowledging that secondary trauma is, even when racial trauma hasn't happened to you, you might have a friend who confides in you over and over. And over time, you holding that hurts. So that's really what I'm talking about with secondary traumatic stress. And I'll be developing something called secondary racial traumatic stress to talk about the race component of it. So next slide. So this is where we talk about racial battle fatigue. So secondary trauma and then racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue was coined by William Smith, who really talks about, again, that racism hurts, that it impacts you mentally, it also impacts you physically and physiologically. So you get a fatigue from racial microaggressions. And again, we don't really talk about that fatigue, but it's documented, and it's documented specifically right now for graduate students, but many undergraduate students can feel similar ways from this as well. Next slide. So here are some self-care tips I just want to offer. One is we have research that shows that it's really important to understand that affinity groups are one outlet. So joining a group, joining your own communities of saying, are there other people that feel like this? Going back to that slide, not really, but if you think about the slide that says, am I crazy? Imagine if that student felt like, I'm not the only Black student. There's more Black students, and I can confide in them and say, is this really happening right now? What do I do with it? So one, finding companionship, colleagueship, finding friendship, finding affinity groups so you have an outlet to talk about this. It's really important. Saying no to extra projects is also very important. Honor your time and anything that does not serve you. This is very important this year. And I say this because it's very different when we're just thinking about racism, or now in a pandemic, or now in a racial pandemic. People are very stressed out. If you don't have the time to honor the other projects, that's okay. And I think it's okay to say, I would love to do this, and maybe in the future I can, but right now I don't have the energy or capacity. And I think if we get in practice in doing that more, we will serve ourselves better long term. Because if I say no to one project, maybe I have more energy to promote in another project. You are not the only person that has to speak up on campus. This is really hard to swallow sometimes, because some of us, sometimes when we come in an activist lens, we think that we're the only key or only person who can solve all of these problems, but we're not. One of the hardest parts to understand about higher education is that it's a system, and it's a system that's been made to replace people quickly. So you are, in fact, not the only person who can make a difference. And that's more for my colleagues and peers. It's how do we create a sustainable process so our students will always feel supported, no matter if we're here or not. But for students, you're not the only student who can make a difference. In fact, you're stronger in numbers. And in fact, what the key to this is, how do I pass on the knowledge I have, the institutional knowledge, meaning that I'm a student who is really proud of maybe starting a traditional event that celebrates Latinx students in some capacity. Okay, great. How do you ensure that that continues once you leave? What is your legacy as a student? And so I think it's important to remember you can make long-term changes if you just shift the way you think about some of these. What are you doing outside of work or school? That's very important too. You cannot always, and this is for those of you who might see yourself as activists, if you're only going to protest, researching, your program as in your major is about this, and all you do is talk about these things, you're going to wear yourself out. So make sure you have something that is self-care, that's non-related to all of that work that has to do with your identity. So for instance, for me, I see myself as a radical educator and activist. And what do? I have 2 dogs. I got myself a puppy this summer because I call it my pandemic puppy. And I take a lot of time, literally, just training him and loving him. It sounds really simple, but that brings me ultimate joy. I take him for walks. I go hiking with them, which I get it. That's very New England. You're like, that's cute, Julia. No one's hiking here. But I think it's important to know. I know. I see, Nayeli, I see you. But, that's for me, right? That's my form of self-care. For you, there might be, I see my friends more often. We take the time, as in Zoom or whatever it is, or, we take the time to talk, text, Snapchat. I spend an hour on TikTok because it makes me happy and I don't have to think of anything else. That's amazing. But and I don't think we should shame ourselves for that. We need outlets right now. What is your outlet? So think about that. I think it's very important. Also, how can you ask your peers to share the work? You're not the only person who can do this. And this is where my white allies and advocates come in. It's very important for the, and I get it. Some of you might have heard this presentation. It was like, oh my God, the word white supremacy. That automatically I feel very uncomfortable. This is very scary. But actually what I'm saying is I actually need my white colleagues and peers to help me advance my work. I need them because they have a power, unfortunately and fortunately. So I'll give a very good example of this. I have I had a policy I had to put forward that had to do with race. I looked to my white male colleague and I said to him, in this next meeting, I really need your support in this if you can. He actually was really helpful and helped me create an argument as to why this should move forward. And I was very grateful for him and I thanked him. And some people will be like, you don't have to thank him, he's just being an advocate. But for me, it's like, no, but you're doing something that not all white people could do. And I want to thank you for that. Thank you for going out of your way to advocate for me. And also, I think it's important to think of the folks that give people a chance to show up for you. And when they don't show up for you, also give feedback of, I really appreciate you trying to work with me in this effort. Think of this for next time, work on this, this, and this. So when someone wants to be an advocate, sometimes I know for me, I'm like, I don't know if I trust you, but no, give people a chance. You'd be surprised. Some people really do show up. And if they don't fully show up, just say, that was amazing. And next time, let's try these things and let's work together better on this, right? We can't shut people out of working with us, unfortunately. What I can do, though, is help show them there's other ways to approach this work. Now, there are also times where I need to center my voice and only my people's voices. And that's when I say to an advocate or ally, I appreciate you wanting to help, but right now, we as a community have to do this for ourselves. So when I'm ready for you to highlight our voice, thank you, and I'll give you the cue. And that way people know I'm still thinking of how they can help, but right now I have to focus on my own community. And I think a lot of people are so scared to ask for community time, but sometimes we need that. Next slide. And I just want to kind of, this is something where I don't necessarily need you to actually vote for this, but I just want you to, these are kind of like points to think about. How many folks have had a role model of color at college, right? Not all of us have role models of color. Now I'm coming from New England, so it's very rare that you have people of color who work at institutions. Your school being in Texas, depending on the area, I get it. You might have actually more often chances to get folks of color, Latinx folks, potentially, but not always. And either way, do you have access? So for instance, we see liberal arts sometimes have more people of color in their departments than a STEM field as in math or science, right? And there's reasons for that. But I think, really what you want to think about is how many of you have had access to a role model that has similar identities to you, because it's very rare sometimes for people. And so I think that's something to think about. How many have received microaggressions while at school? And I'm sure many of you have. How many people feel like they could report such an incident? Because if there's no system to report this, it's more likely to lead more harm. And how often can you self-advocate? I think some of you might say, I can self-advocate sometimes, but oftentimes you're also thinking about places where self-advocating gets you into more trouble. And you have to think about, and to me, it's always like, well, why does it get me into trouble? What's the system there? And how do I kind of override that? Others I need to be creating conversations with, or how do I implement all of this? So those are just some things to think about and reflect on for yourself. And then I guess, this is kind of where I want to have conversations with you all of, what surprises you about some of this work and what does not? Because some of this, if you're doing this, if you're in this, you're like, this makes a lot of sense. And some of you might be like, I had no clue this was happening or a thing, and that's okay too. So, I think, again, this is where I think, I'd love to hear people's thoughts, reactions, and or questions, because to me, this is a community effort. And I think we have to kind of come together and think about, what does it mean, right? What does it mean to have these conversations? What does it mean to show up? What does it mean to ask others to show up with us, though, as well? Because at the end of the day, what I really want people to understand is, in order to self-care and self-love, I have to really reflect. I really have to take the time to ask myself, what do I need? But I also have to learn how to ask others to help me. If I can't communicate what I need in this moment, others aren't mind readers. Right now, I'm seeing a lot of students across the nation taking screenshots of their peers saying racist things, sexist things, homophobic things, and sending it to the administration and telling us, can you take care of this? And I've said to the students, I will help you. I will help you with this conversation and give you some script points, because what I really want you to do is talk to your peers, because that's actually a skill you need in life. Is you need to be able to learn how to have these conversations. But I will make sure that if you need me to be there to help, have that conversation, I don't want you to do this alone if you don't feel comfortable doing this. If you want to practice and run this script through with me, that's fine. But the goal here is how do we have students not only know how to have hard conversations, but also how to self-care and how to also think of this in a lens of when we have hard times, remember, it's actually you have been resilient more so in a way that maybe you've given credit. The fact that you're in college is such a privilege. The majority of Americans don't ever have access to conversations like this. And I actually think it's why we're really divided as a nation right now. And I recognize that all of us are politically even on the same spectrum. But the fact that we're here to have these conversations, I think, is what gives me hope as a nation, because it means that we have the ability to think about where do our perspectives come together? Where do they come apart? But also, where can we meet in a middle ground or in a way that allows us all to just be? Because at the end of the day, nothing's going to stop me from being openly, proudly Latinx and queer. But what could stop me is policies against me, right? And so I think it's saying, how do I self-care to know I'm always going to be here. Nothing's going to stop that. And I got to honor my own voice in that and not compromise it, but still understand there's room to include others on my journey of self advocating, because there has to be. So, yeah, I'd love to open this conversation up to folks.
Students, this is a time now to ask questions with Julia as it relates to what was presented, and really just thinking about the context here at TAMU, you know, right? Like, we are an institution that's 95% Latino, Latinx, and how different some of these concepts may be. But I love your previous slide of the poll of like how many students actually have experienced microaggressions here. And how many of us are doing the work, right? Microaggressions don't only exist in a racial lens, it exists inside of a gender identity or expression or sexuality, things of that nature. And just thinking about those areas, those microaggressions happen on multiple levels. So students, this is a time now to think about what we talked about.
I think there's also two facts there, and thinking about, you know, Latinx cultures and identities too. Colorism is a big thing in our community. You know, how indigenous, how Black we are, or how white we are, that makes a huge difference on how we think of others, which is problematic. Class, some of us come from money, some of us don't, and somewhere in the middle, you know. So, you know, just because we're all of one race, there's so many different ways to view this, these conversations on microaggressions, because you know, and I also think the hardest part about this is right now, you might have mentors and a way of healing because you're at an institution with people like you. What is it going to be like when you're back in the world? And it may not represent what you're currently in, which is scary. I mean, I worked for women's colleges for 6 years, and women there they thrived. And then as soon as they left, they're like, oh, this is not the world I thought I was going to be. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be a hard transition out. So, you know, because it's not all women running things. In fact, men are running the things in the corporate situations that they were talking about. So again, you know, maybe you're surrounded by your own people right now, but going back to the real world, you're like, oh man, this isn't it.
Oh, hi there.
Jonathan.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Jonathan Monca. So coming from what you've been saying, discussing about in your presentation, I think a lot of times when it comes towards how people can sometimes mistreat others based on, you know, their gender, sexual orientation, identity, and etc. A lot of it can go back to based on how what people were raised, you know, in their family sets. I know, for example, I didn't personally experience this, but I know a member of my family, a member of my family had experienced something crucial to that. He was in the closet. He didn't come out as gay to his parents, and so I believe that they had that traditional mindset of seeing how things are usually done, and so he was always afraid of that. So he came towards the time when he got older to finally confess and, have the courage enough to come out and say it. Unfortunately, they didn't take that well. It's kind of, I guess, in a way where I can say this is that they made a punishment for him by calling every single member of my close family to confess, oh, I'm sorry, like to apologize for being gay and stuff like that. That relative of mine was actually very close to my mother. So when she told me this, I didn't get a chance to meet him before he left. He moved up north, I think. I don't know where he is right now, but he just wanted to get away from, from family and stuff like that and be on his own, get away from this experience. But I think that sometimes in life, when you look at things, there's always going to be people that are going to look like to the future, going to move with the times and being able to improve upon oneself and how they treat others, while there's still sadly going to be people that are still following those traditional values that have been passed down to them every generation, and bringing that into the next generation as it goes. And that's how, that just continues on going as we see it, even though like years pass and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And I think right there you hit on a word that's specific to this: tradition. What is a tradition? I am someone who I think one of the reasons I'm so successful in my field is I know the balance of respecting a tradition, but asking it to be updated. As in, when I've worked at institutions, I said I've worked for institutions that were created when the country was created. Because in New England, a lot of these colleges were some of the first colleges to exist. And I said, while I respect the tradition this college has, and it's a long-standing tradition, we need to update it because it's not allowing for all our students to be celebrated. Women of color, people of color, LGBTQ, Native American students, what have you. And so, again, I think this is something now I understand the Latinx culture, traditions is everything. That's culture, and I think in some ways we have to think of tradition as a sense of not assimilating, right? Because a lot of Americans, specifically Latinx Americans, have been forced to assimilate to this country in ways, and some pockets of the area. And I feel like Texas has, I remember visiting certain parts of Texas where that actually has not. People have remained in their culture, and it's very much a sense of a pride, right? But I think it's how do we how do we challenge that respectfully? And I think with a lot of Latinx individuals, it's like, you can't challenge your family. That's not real. But, I think you as an individual can one day maybe say, I understand my parents have a way of thinking. I understand that I can also, as an individual, take parts of that and understand that parts of it may not be how I think. And how do I maybe not have engagement with my parents on it, but maybe it's saying, one day, maybe I reach out to that relative, or maybe one day I think about what I can do next time I have a friend who is LGBTQ and Latinx, right? So again, it's not necessarily about, we don't have to say those traditions are not a thing. We can honor them, love them, accept those values, but also say, for me personally, it maybe looks differently for me as an individual. And again, that's very hard because being different is hard in this world. Humans naturally go for humans who look like them. And I'm sure, someone who's LGBTQ and moves away, what they normally do will look for, that's why we talk about chosen family. Maybe my family didn't accept me for who I am, but my chosen family sees me for everything I am. And now I have that outlet. I think that's one of the ways that we can see for Latinx LGBTQ individuals, a way of resiliency is even when I'm not loved by this immediate family, I have love other places, and love is still found, and that love cannot be taken from me. And so I think that's important. I think that example is a good one of how, I think another question someone asked was, how do we, how do we explain to people that have the best of intentions, but they make mistakes like misgendering? It goes against, again, this of, remember as students, right? This is a quote by Paulo Freire, who's an educational philosopher, who talks about that schools do not change people, people change people. And I say that because I also want to put out there, I, as a person, I can give you many different perspectives. And some of those perspectives you can accept and want to learn about. And some of those perspectives, you may not have anything you want to do with them. And I can respect that because you as an individual have to decide what your values are, what your systems are, and you have to be the one who also upholds them, right? So I think it's important for us to understand we can't change people. People change themselves. But what we can do is offer a person a challenge of, hey, I've noticed that you keep misgendering or using the wrong pronouns. Did you want me to help you understand them? And they're like, oh, or they might be like, actually, yeah, I'm really confused about this. And, or it's their way of knowing like, oh, okay, I got to do better. There's ways that we can say, I understand it might be confusing, but it's really important that when you address me, you use they, them, or it's really important when you address me, you use these other form of pronouns. I think explaining to people, but I always remind myself that I'll teach people 1 or 2 times, but when I see them taking advantage of my teaching, then I'm like, we've been through this conversation. I'm respectfully going to decline and going further because I have to save myself. And I think that's important for you all to remember. Try to educate others when you can, but at some point you have to remember, do not do harm to yourself in educating others.
And I think that's a great segue here, Julia, to the next question that we had from Alexis, who said they didn't know what to expect from the session. They found it very inspiring and informative, but they ask, how can we help folk confront their peers when their peers have such opposing views and beliefs, right?
Yeah, I mean, I literally have my own student leaders being like, I just want people to change. I just want people to understand these things. And I think part of this is, let's also remember, right? Who imposes these views is the media. I think one of the things that and people, they're often shocked when I say this, but, when you look at, there's a lot of documentaries that talk about this. Google is made to only show you what you want to see, right? They're algorithms. So to be honest, a lot of times I not only read news that I would naturally look at, that like I was brought up on NPR, I was brought up on public, news information and local information. But I think that's the problem right there is not enough people look at what's going on in a national perspective, regional perspectives. Not enough people understand the international ways of being and doing things. As Americans, we tend to think of only the region we're in and the things that were most relevant to us, right? I look at conservative news just to understand how people look at some of my information. And I don't look at it as if it's something I have to pay for, because I'm not going to necessarily give my money towards that. But what I am going to do is just understand. I remember when I was first looking into conservative news and their views on transgender individuals, there was language I was like, oh my gosh, this is very transphobic. But it actually informed me on how people look at transgender individuals, which actually helped me think about if I had to work with someone who had such an opposing point of view, how I could respond to that. And I think that was something that was very knowledgeable and helped me understand where people are coming from. I cannot assume that everyone is at my level of education. That's very narcissistic. So I have to be able to meet people where they're at. And again, but this is so where you can say to your peers of, I'm surprised that you think this, or can you tell me more about what that's based on? I academically, we always say, can you cite your sources? And I think it's saying like, I'd like to have a bigger conversation. Would you be open to that? But this is where, as folks, we have to remember, ask yourself what your limit is. If you are trying to work with a student and peers and say, I'm trying to change their mind, remember, you may not have that ability or power, but also to what point are you going to tap out of the conversation? So if they keep going on and they're just saying these things that are very offensive, I might say, I'm allowing this to go for another 10 minutes. And after that, I'm going to tap out. That's what you need to do. Set boundaries for yourself. It's okay to say, I want to work with you and I want to see if we can learn from each other. But at some point, if that learning becomes harmful, put a boundary on it. I think students are afraid to do that with each other. And I understand it's uncomfortable, but just say, you know what, it looks like we're not going to meet in the middle on this, or we're not going to really understand each other. Maybe we'll take a breath and maybe at some other point we'll pick up this conversation, but it sounds like we're frustrating each other and that's okay. And then move on, and think about, should I have reflected or respected that person differently? Should I have looked into more information? Or if not, maybe I did what I need to do and that's okay.
Well, thank you so very much here, Julia. It has been an absolute pleasure having you here for the second installment of the International Leadership Series. I think this topic right now, and especially as we head towards the election, and some of the aftermath that may happen, depending on whatever outcome it may be, and especially with us living here directly on the Rio Grande Valley River, right? And literally being at the epicenter of this very divisive wall that exists, right? Like we are the location that the current administration wants to build that wall in, right? And separating us from our lifeblood, the river, while also separating us from our sister city, Nuevo Laredo, in Mexico, and just understanding how that trauma can be there and how is that going there. So anyway, I greatly appreciate once again you coming and speaking to our students. These are so important topics. For our students here, please make sure that you click on the link that was put into the chat. The link is used for tracking your attendance at the sessions. All of you in attendance today will have an opportunity to receive a $10 food voucher. Come to our office to pick it up. And as we move forward here, Julia's contact information is still on the screen. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to contact them via email. Once again, let's give a round of applause virtually for, I think there's lots of thank yous all around, just for your experience and your story and helping our students navigate through this self-care that happens.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day. It was great meeting with you.
Bye, Julia. Thank you so much, Julia.